Last year, Indonesia recorded a GDP of about $1 trillion US. If we were to just hypothetically extrapolate the economy growing at 5% real growth, put on top of that 5% inflation rate, let it grow year on year for 20 years, barring catastrophic scenarios that could disrupt the trajectory, we could end up with a GDP of 6 to 7 trillion US dollars 20 years from today. If we were to accumulate all the GDPs going from $1 trillion last year, ending up with 6 to 7 trillion US dollars 20 years from today, the accumulation of the GDPs of Indonesia over a 20-year period is about 60 trillion US dollars. It's a lot of donuts. 60 trillion US dollars. Now, the key is, are we going to be able to maintain linearity? I see the glass half full because of the youth that's there. Now, if we go by the assumption that 60% of the economy will relate to domestic consumption, there's going to be $36 trillion US dollars that will be consumed in terms of goods and services by Indonesians in the next 20-year period. If we go by the assumption that the government will be spending about 20% of the GDP, the government has been spending about 20% of its GDP, the government will be spending about 12 trillion US dollars in the next 20-year period. If we were to assume that the government will stay on course in terms of spending 20% of its budget on education, which we're mandated to do by way of the Constitution that was amended a few years ago, the government will be spending $2.4 trillion in the next 20 years. That's 20% of the 12 trillion US dollars on education. With that kind of money, we'll be able to fill up this room with Indonesians. Not just the campus in Singapore, but the campuses, whether it's the MITs, Cambridge, Oxfords, Harvards, Stanfords. I gotta mention NTU and NUS. And of course SMU. It's real, ladies and gentlemen. Just by simple extrapolation. Sure, there's a possibility of externalities or catastrophic scenarios that could disrupt the trajectory, but if that were to go in a linear fashion at just 5% real growth, we've got a chance at educating Indonesia better and bigger. The problem is, today Indonesia only has 20,000 PhDs. China has 600,000 PhDs. India has 600,000 PhDs. We don't have not only enough PhDs, we don't have enough masters, bachelors, ITE graduates, and plumbers. So we've got to start somewhere. And the good thing is we've got the fiscal space to do it. So if we can achieve this 2.4 trillion US dollars in the next 20 years, we can spend it right, I think we can have a better future. I think we can be relevant. I think we can start thinking about being side by side with China, with India, with Brazil, with South Korea. At the moment, we can only be proud of having a large scale and being able to sell coal and palm oil. Can't even make iPhones. That's a sad truth. But there's a growing number of Indonesians who see the glass half full. And that's what matters. And I had the honor of meeting up with some Indonesians at this campus. I was told by Arnold that there's about 3% of the population that are Indonesians. Why don't we make that 10%? Last year, the Ministry of Trade sent 111 of its staff overseas to Singapore, Australia, Japan, the US, and Europe. The year before, we only sent 3. We've got the money now. We can actually allocate budget for purpose of sending people to get better educated. So the possibilities are quite enormous. Now, I can't end my remarks without talking about the politics. I think the politics is very interesting. Politics and economics are related, and they tend to influence each other. We're all aware that this prolonged slump has the ability of affecting adversely the democratic values and institutions. You've heard of, you've seen speeches made by people who want to go forward in Indonesia. One person takes the strongman approach. Another person takes the institutionalization approach. I think what's important and relevant is that we've got to be able to continue this democratization on a path, but mix that with the institutionalization. But we can't have an institutionalization of democracy if we don't have the right people sitting at the different institutions. We can't have that now because we just don't have as many educated people as we should. Going back to the fiscal space reference, I think we've got a chance. The debate about the future will linger from a political standpoint. And I think time will tell. And if one were to size up and assess what would be the main legacies of SBY by 2014 when he steps down, I think the first legacy would be the trajectory of sustained economic development. The second would be the consolidation of ideologies. You would have heard of the announcement by the election committee a couple of weeks ago that would have weeded down the number of political parties that qualify to just 10. I remember in 1998 when we just learned about democracy as Suharto stepped down, we had more than 100 parties. The last election we had 34 parties. For next year, we're only going to have 10 parties. And you're seeing a rise of the nationalist agenda holders, which I think has a good probability of securing policy continuity post-SBY, post-2014. And that's good for business. That's good for Singapore. That's good for ASEAN. But first of all, it's good for Indonesia, because that's the track and the path that we want to stay on. Politically, I think the view-taking for Indonesia, the narrative ought to be with respect to not just the economic story, not just the economic thesis or narrative, but it has to be with respect to the rule of law. The rule of law is important. We get hammered all the time for not being able to deliver legal certainties. Not all the time, but many times. And you guys know it better than I do. You, Singapore being the biggest investor, have not seen it perfect in Indonesia. There have been imperfections, admittedly. And we've got to make sure that this gets fixed. The rule of law, I think, becomes an issue by way of just one or two institutions that need to be taken a view of. That, I think, has some hope in getting fixed because one or two of those are within the realm of the executive branch. So it all depends on who basically moves forward, whether she or he has the vision, the heart, and the guts to basically act upon it. Because if we have the necessary rule of law, there will be level playing field with the Indias of the world, with the Chinas of the world. There will be level playing field for ASEAN with the rest of the world. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult. See, I always see whatever happens to Indonesia happens to Singapore in a lot of ways. Whatever we have to export and import has to go through Singapore. If Indonesia grows, Singapore will inevitably grow. Not necessarily if Singapore grows, Indonesia will grow. But the logic is the former. Next year, I think, is a defining moment. It will be interesting. And I want to quote Jimi Hendrix again. Obviously, you haven't moved. I hope I'm not singing out of tune. But to quote Jimmy, basically Indonesia has been able to afford to buy bread. In the future, we just got to make sure we can put something in between. Thank you very much.